morning, Professor March.
Good morning. It is very good to see you here.
So maybe let's start with the first question. In your work, you present a world that is very challenging for humans. It's a world quite distinct from the one in classical economics. And could you just tell us a little bit more about the key differences?
Well, first of all, I think you shouldn't overemphasize the differences. At least the early work really accepted the basic framework of classical economics, that it was concerned with decision-making and consequential decision-making. People were looking at the world, trying to make decisions that would put them to a better place in the world. And the differences were fairly important, but the similarities were also there. But over time, the differences have grown, I think, and they come in two parts of the theory, I think. One is the part about what kind of environment are organizations in. And in the classical theory, the environment is knowable. That is, you can figure out what actions are connected to what consequences, at least up to a probability distribution. We tended to move toward a less knowable environment, one that was chaotic, that was complex, that was difficult to understand, and tended to examine the effects of that kind of environment. The other part that was different was the conception of the actors, whether they're individuals or organizations. In the classical theory, the actors had very good, consistent preferences. The preferences were stable, they were consistent, they were precise, and we found preferences to be somewhat unstable, generally inconsistent, and generally not very precise, and that made a difference. The other thing was that we tended to observe that human beings had limited computational facilities, so that they could not deal with the complexity very well. And the demands of the classical theory for the individual actors was very substantial. So those differences were fairly significant, and over time, probably the most important difference that we had in the early days but didn't emphasize was the extent to which behavior is not driven by consequences, but it's driven by some kind of routines or rules, and so that the logic is different.
So taking into consideration that people are bounded rational, does organizing people reduce the effect of bounded rationality, or does it introduce new challenges?
Well, I think it's interesting that we called it bounded rationality because people have emphasized the bounded, but a lot of it was basically a rational view of decision-making. Now, whether organizing increases or decreases the rationality, I think, is an open question. In some respects, it certainly increases rationality. It makes things more explicit. It makes, since people have to justify themselves to each other, and they tend to justify themselves in rational terms, it tends to move toward a rational ideology, at least. On the other hand, when you have an organization, you have conflict, you have communication problems, you have an assortment of things that of that sort that makes it probably harder to be perfectly rational.
So you mentioned conflict. So when the actors in the organizations are in conflict, what happens to the actions of the organizations? Does organizations stop acting or making decisions?
Well, it doesn't stop acting, obviously. You may say that it's the concept of making decisions gets a little uncertain, But at least what we pointed out was that organizations sometimes attend to goals sequentially rather than simultaneously, so that if there's conflict, some groups get attended to today and other groups get attended to tomorrow, and you hope that the joint effects will not be noticed. The organizations decentralize, so they build buffers between the various preferences that they have, so that one part of the organization is following one set of preferences, another part is following another set, and the processes by which they're made consistent with each other are very weak. So that yes, they do make decisions, they take actions, but those actions do not necessarily fulfill any notion of a sort of consistent rationality.
Mm-hmm. So together with Michael Cohen and Johan Olsen, you've crafted the garbage can model, which caused quite a stir among the proponents of consequential decision-making. Why was that so controversial?
Well, they should answer that, not I. No, I don't know why anyone would be concerned. But if I had to speculate, I think the title, garbage can, probably offended people's sensibilities a little bit. That is, if you're thinking seriously about an organization and trying hard to make decisions, for someone to say the process is like a garbage can is perhaps perceived as insulting. We thought it was playful, but it might be perceived as insulting. Now, if you go beyond the label to the actual process, we found fairly often people in organizations said, yeah, that's what happens. It was not hard for them to see a garbage can process, but for some, it was too chaotic. It was too, there wasn't enough rationality to that system.
And originally this garbage can model, it was developed to describe an organized anarchy type of organization. And can the same model be also used to represent a competitive firm? So when we think about more pressures coming from the environment.
Well, we first applied it to educational institutions, and that seemed fairly straightforward. Subsequently, it seems to me it fairly easily applies to competitive firms, that the kinds of things we noted, the connection of things by their simultaneity rather than by their substantive connection, is as common in business firms as it is in educational institutions. The ideologists of business firms would like to present them as highly rational. The realists of business firm recognize they really aren't, and that the garbage can contains many elements of a proper description of what's going on there.
And you've written quite extensively on rule-based behavior, calling it the logic of appropriateness. How is it different from the logic of consequence decision-making that is enshrined in classical economics?
Well, that's a very fundamental difference, and we've spent a good deal of time talking about it. The simplest way of describing it is if you follow a logic of consequences, what you ask is, what are my alternatives? What are the consequences of each of those alternatives? And how do I value those consequences? And then you act so as to achieve good consequences rather than bad consequences, or in the standard decision theory version, to choose the alternative with the highest expected value. If you follow the logic of appropriateness, you ask a different set of questions. You say, what kind of a person am I? What kind of a situation is this? I will do in this situation what a person such as I is supposed to do in this kind of situation. So that the logic of appropriateness does not ask what are the consequences? And of course, the logic of consequences does not ask, what kind of a person am I?
And can the two logics be reconciled?
Well, in some way, trivially. That is, if you are a true believer in the logic of consequences, then the logic of appropriateness is simply a solution by which you get the best consequences, so that the rules have been evolved over time in such a way as to be functionally best. And therefore, when you follow the rules of the appropriate of consequence, when you follow the logic of appropriateness, you are following the rules that have evolved in a consequential way. So, and therefore you can predict the rules from the consequences. If you're a true believer in the logic of appropriateness, the consequential reasoning is simply one of the sets of rules. You have learned that an appropriate thing to do is to calculate expected value and choose the highest expected value. And that's as rule-bound as any other kind of rule, and as empty of sort of any kind of logic of consequences. It's simply an appropriate rule. Now, you can easily do that, and of course some people do that, but it's not very productive, I think, to do that. I think these are better seen as two different logics, that most people have both of them in their repertoire. They use sometimes, and one sometimes, and others other times, and that there's a tension between them sometimes. And that, I think, is closer to what actually is going on.
You started writing about rule-based behavior at quite early points. So how does your picture of rule-based behavior evolve, like from the time of the Cyert and March book to now?
Well, it's hard for me to know. But I think that in Cyert and March, we basically said a lot of behavior is routines. Organizations have standard operating procedures, and they follow standard operating procedures, and that's a lot of the behavior. Nelson and Winter came along and said, "Oh, those look like genes," and we can build an evolutionary theory around the idea that it's routine-based behavior. And I think, on the whole, I thought that was a very interesting, good direction to go. Later on, when Olson and I started working, we discovered that much of the public sector organization is rule-based, and we became quite interested in how those rules are created, they change, how they're implemented, what kind of errors are made, and things of that sort. And so we turned much more to what's the process by which rules evolve. And that goes on, and much of the stuff that I've done subsequently on learning is very much oriented to that.
You've mentioned the notion of routines from Nelson and Winter, and they kind of specified their own view of what those rules are as very situated, context specific, and they focus on the productive knowledge side of things. Now, your notion of the logic of appropriateness seem to be similar, but what, in your opinion, are the key differences or similarities between those two concepts?
Well, I think they're fairly similar. There's very little in the Nelson and Winter discussions that I would disagree with. But there's a little difference in emphasis, I think. I suspect the work that I've done, people working with me have done, has focused more on how do rules arise, how do they change, how are they implemented, what kinds of limitations are there, and such things. But it's much less functional, as it does not try to say, do the better rules arise, or do the poorer rules arise? It just tries to see, how do rules arise, how are they used? Nelson and Winter rules are embedded in an evolutionary framework, and although their evolutionary framework is not the evolutionary framework of simple equilibria and reliable outcomes, they are still pushing more and more toward how does the system as a whole evolve over time.
You wrote that following logic of appropriateness may lead individual to follow rules without or in spite of calculation of consequences and expected utilities. It's quite surprising to expect the person to make a decision that intentionally choose an inferior alternative.
No. Well, it's only surprising if you believe in the logic of consequences. It's surprising if you think, well, people ought to prefer alternatives that lead them to better consequences. But it's not surprising at all if you think, well, no, that's not how it happens. You say, what kind of a person am I? What does such a person do? And we know all kinds of examples where people pursue what they think is appropriate to their identity that lead them to bad consequences, but the consequences may or may not matter to them, but the procedure does not start with asking what are the consequences. And much of our behavior clearly is of that form. I am a man, I do what a man does. And most men doing what a man does get into trouble from time to time. Or I am a plumber, I do what a plumber does. Well, plumbers sometimes get into trouble doing what a plumber does.
And how is the logic of appropriateness connected to things like moral behavior, ethics, culture?
Well, as you well know, there are quite a few theories of ethics. And one of those theories of ethics is basically rationality. That it is ethical as long as it is rational. That's basically the idea. Most theories of ethics are not of quite that form. Most theories of ethics imagine some set of rules or some set of procedures that may in fact get you to a place that's different from a consequential analysis, and that the virtue that is celebrated in morality is the virtue of doing what you're supposed to do, not what is good for you, economically or consequentially. So that most theories of morality contrast consequentiality with some kind of moral code. In the Christian religion, the Ten Commandments do not say, thou shalt not commit murder unless it works well for you. I mean, that's not what they say. They say, thou shalt not commit murder. And most of the moral codes have that character to them. And they indeed, most of them have the proposition that there's no virtue without temptation. And temptation in a moral code is almost always consequential. It's something that you some way in which you can be better off if you violate the code. And unless there's that, the code isn't very important. It is I think it was Kierkegaard who said, if a religion can be justified, and he meant justified consequentially, it is hardly a religion. The only justification of religion is that it demands things that are not consequential. And I think a lot of moral codes are of that sort.
So, rule-based behavior conjures up these images of an automatic, stable, and reliable process. But to what extent is it so?
Well, I think it's a mixed. You have to have a mixed answer to that. On the one hand, it's clear that rules change, that they aren't reliably enforced or followed, that they may be quite inconsistent. One rule may be quite inconsistent. All those things we observe. At the same time, we should notice that making rules, making routines are a fundamental instrument by which organizations achieve stability and reliability. That's their purpose quite often, and their purpose is achieved quite often. So that you want a rule often in order to get stability and consistency and reliability. Now, as you well know, they don't always produce that. And one of the things that's interesting to study when you study rules is how they change, how people deal with multiple conflicting rules, and how people avoid following them.
So can you tell us a bit more about the process through which those rules change?
Well, I co-authored a book on that, which I'm sure you read. And we tried to study the rules at Stanford University, actually, and to understand sort of in a very quantitative way what are the factors that produce changes. And I'm not sure I can reproduce right now all of the results, but we asked questions like, is a change more likely if it's been more often? If a rule has changed more often in the past, is it more or less likely to change now? If the rule has changed recently, is it more or less likely to change now? And I think we found in general that the more often a rule had changed, the more likely it was change again. And the more recently it changed, the less likely it was to change again. Well, those results are a specific organization, a specific set of rules, but it's the kind of question you might want to ask. Now, you also might want to ask, it's a little harder to ask quantitatively, but you might want to ask, what are the political conditions for rule change? Because one of the things we observed was that rules changed when there were problems. And problems in an organization are often political. You get relatively large numbers of changes under conditions in which there are problems, and then those changes then those rules have a certain dynamic of their own subsequently.
We know that rules are coded from experience, and it's normally assumed that more experience will lead to more intelligent behavior, better rules, and even superior performance.
Well, that's the fantasy of some evolutionary theories, right? And there are problems with it, of course. That first of all, what is intelligent behavior? And most people, I think, mean by intelligent behavior that satisfies your preferences, or something like that. And that gets a little difficult if your preferences are changing and are in conflict and so on. If you observe, as we did in that book, that rules solve problems, then in the sense that the problem space gets smaller, then yes, rules reduce the problem space, and that's consistent with the proposition that over time rules have fewer and fewer changes because they're eating into the problem space, there are more problems, and in that sense they're more intelligent. But the notion that magically through learning we will end up with the optimum set of rules, I think is fanciful. The process has all of the traps of standard evolutionary theory. There aren't typically equilibria, and if there are equilibria, there are multiple equilibria. And so, in some sense, I think it's likely that most of the time, as rules change, they, in some sense, make things better. But whether they're more intelligent, in some long-run sense, is, I think, harder to claim.
And can you tell us a little bit more about those traps, the standard evolutionary traps when it comes to learning from experience?
Well, my favorite one, of course, is the competency trap. That your performance on a particular activity is a joint effect of the activity's capability, potential, and your skill at the activity. And as you gain experience, your skill gets greater, so you do better with that activity. That complicates making choices among activities because you're more skillful at some than at others, and the joint effect is that you end up preferring to do something that is not the best optimal activity. That is a more or less inexorable thing, that when you choose an activity and are successful at it, you will use it again. When you use it again, you get better at it, and when you're more likely to be successful, and it's a very nice, tight, positive feedback loop. I think it's one of the more important observations we have in our studies of organizations.
Mm-hmm. But from time to time, also organizations might encounter the situations that they don't have enough experience to make an inference and to make a decision. And how do they overcome the problem of paucity of experience?
How do you mean experience? Well, the question is quite right. That is, normal experience is quite limited. You're trying to make judgments on the basis of single cases or a small number of cases in a world that is quite complex and probabilistic, so that what happens in a single case or a small number of cases may be quite distant from what is this average performance. How can you combat that? Well, one obvious one, which many people have noticed, is to be relatively persistent. That, in a sense, that says don't learn too fast. Don't adjust too quickly on the basis of small amounts of data. Now, there's some cost to that, of course, but the errors of fast learning are pretty obvious. The more traditional ways are to do small experiments. If you do small experiments, you can run them for a fair amount of time. You can see what works, what doesn't work, and assuming you can scale up without any difficulty, then you can take the better results from the experiments, small experiments, and make large commitments. Very sensible activity. Another one is to steal from your competitors. Let them run the experiments, and you learn from them. And insofar as you can, that's a perfectly good way of experimenting at low cost. So I think the big secret in this is to recognize that normal learning undersamples failure. Normal learning makes you abandon things in which you fail before you know much about them. And therefore you are likely to abandon good things too soon. Now, of course, if you're persistent, if you stay with bad things, quite often you will just be pouring more money down the drain. But that's a standard problem of learning.
So, Professor, you wrote that engineering organizations is quite a formidable task. Is it possible to improve an evolutionary process?
Sure. If you understand it, then that's when you understand it, you can almost always see ways in which you can intervene on it. In most evolutionary processes, there are two kinds of things you can, quote, improve on. One is to improve the efficiency of the selection, and the other is to improve the variety of the novelty in the process. Now, if you look at sort of organizational evolution or the revolution of rules and so on, the efficiency is really how you improve learning. And learning, I mentioned earlier, one of the things that usually is possible with learning is to increase the persistence with failure. Now, the other aspect of efficiency is imitation, the imitation of others. And one of the dangers of imitation is that everyone is connected to everyone else. They imitate and they converge too fast to a suboptimal solution. So one of the things in the engineering trick is to keep people somewhat disconnected so that they do not converge too rapidly. And that's I've claimed at least that's one of the advantages of traditional nationalism, that the great advantage of a separation between European scholars of organization and North American scholars of organization is that they did not converge. And similarly, Asian scholars and so on. There's some cost to that, but it's very important for improving the efficiency of imitation. The other side is the novelty of how do you encourage novelty, and I've worked an awful lot on that. I don't know that I have a good understanding of it. I understand some of the problems. The deepest problem with novelty is that most novel ideas are bad ones. And if you specialize in novel ideas, you specialize in bad ideas. And that's not a good way to survive. So somehow or other, in a system, you have to encourage more novelty without killing off everybody. And that's an engineering problem where, the sort of Silicon Valley type solution is to have easy entry, easy creation, and quick death. So that, I don't know what the percentage is, but something like 90 to 99% of Silicon Valley startups die. And they're all, or many of them, are trying novel things. And so there's a lot of novelty, and most of it does not affect the major companies because they're not doing it. So that's one sort of classic solution. Have novelty focused in new entries that are small and you can kill off very easily. But suppose you want to have novelty in your own organization. Well, then one obvious strategy is to decentralize, to create a little startup within your company and with all the properties of a startup. And some companies have tried that with some success. And if you look at things like what made Xerox PARC so innovative. And it's hard not to look at that history without saying, well, one of the things that made Xerox PARC so innovative is that it was really disconnected from the company. No one was paying any attention to what they were doing. No one was profiting from anything they were doing. And they were doing whatever they damn please. And that seemed to help the creation of novelty. Mm-hmm. I've done a little work on trying to understand what I call the generation of outliers, and looking at the Rand Corporation. And for a brief period in the 50s and 60s, the Rand Corporation generated an awful lot of new ideas, particularly in economics and organizations, actually. Why? How? And it's a very similar story that the key thing in that case is they were cut off from the Air Force in this case. They were cut off, but they were enthusiastically supported, and that's a good combination. But anyway, if you're going to engineer an evolutionary process, you have to work on improving selection, you have to work on improving novelty.
Mm-hmm. So your depiction of the Silicon Valley model seems to be closely related to a writing of technology of foolishness. So who is the fool and who benefits from the foolishness in this case?
Well, the idea of technology of foolishness was that you needed somehow to generate ideas that were new, novelty, and they would in fact look foolish to the establishment, to the established ideas. What makes a fool? Well, I've tried to. Well, what makes a fool and what makes a fool persist? And I think there are probably lots of answers to that, but let me point out one. The fools tend to be disconnected from the establishment. These sort of standard stories in Silicon Valley is that people drop out of college or they don't feel comfortable in college. The fools tend to congregate with each other. So you have collections of fools called hackers or whatever they're called. And for me, it sounds an awful lot like juvenile delinquents. And I think that if you want to understand generating novelty, look at juvenile delinquents. Here are a bunch of people who do a lot of novel things. I mean, most of them are socially unacceptable, but they are novel, and they know that they're rejected, they suffer for it, but they form gangs, and those gangs support them, and they persist. So novelty is as I usually call it, an alien intruder, and organizations and societies will react to alien intruders in a negative way. So how do you protect alien intruders from elimination? That's now I emphasize that because the romantic stories of novelty and creativity and foolishness make it sound as though it's a glorious thing, and the victors won and everyone gathered around and cheered them. Well, that's the final stage of a long process of being kicked and scorned and everything else.
So, especially the Xerox PARC is a wonderful example of a technological novelty, but also a prime example of a missed business opportunity. How can organizations harness this novelty? So, kind of, how they can be not only supportive but also inviting of this novelty without suffering the consequences?
I think it's very difficult. And socially, I'm not sure it's a good idea. The key to Xerox PARC was that Xerox didn't pay any attention to them, didn't use them. If Xerox had paid more attention, Xerox PARC probably would have developed in a different way, in a less creative, interesting way. So you want, in your whole system, you want some of these deviant, alien cultures to survive, but to integrate them into an individual company will tend to undermine them. So then your engineering problem is really fairly severe. How do you get Xerox to create an organization that doesn't really help Xerox in its competitive thing, but helps the industry? And that's a very fundamental problem, and it's a fairly general problem in the novelty area, that you need novelty, but novelty is unlikely to help particularly the places where it is born or is nurtured. And that's that's a standard problem of organizations in societies of organizations. There are some things that are good for the society but not particularly good for the organization. And we have difficulty with those things.
So how can a society support and maintain foolishness?
Well, I think it does it mostly by mistake. There's slack. We all know that organizations generate slack. Well, slack is a breeding ground for innovation. It's also a breeding ground for laziness and a lot of other things. But it relaxes control, and when it relaxes control, it allows novelty to arise, and some small fraction of that novelty may be useful. But you have to have a kind of system that is willing to go with a process that generates mostly mistakes and an occasional good thing. And that's a hard system to create.
You wrote about beauty, truth, and justice as the important criteria in evaluating social science theories. So how do you think classical economics and behavioral theory and the Carnegie tradition should score on each of these dimensions?
Well, I think that's a good question, but I'm not sure I can give it a very precise answer. I think that on the criterion of truth, the behavioral theory clearly wins. I don't think there is question, because some of my friends would disagree, but I think it's fairly clear that the behavioral theory comes closer to accurately describing what goes on in organizations. With respect to beauty, I think it's fairly clear that economic theory is more beautiful. It's simpler, it's more elegant, you can actually derive theorems and all this wonderful stuff. With respect to justice, I would say that the behavioral theory clearly has an advantage. That the economic theory generates people who are greedy and unconcerned about social welfare. And that's just a natural consequence of the thinking. And so, the way at least I've talked about justice of a set of ideas is, do they create people who make the world better? And I think in this case, I would say that economic theory creates people who make the world worse.
Is it also one of the reasons you've been avoiding writing or about power, or always the question of power was something that you felt very?
Well, yeah, I think I'm in print to say that emphasis upon power tends to produce people who are less attractive than theories that don't emphasize power. And by and large, I've written about power, but I don't use it as a concept very much.
And if the world that the organizations occupy is too complex to understand and let alone to control, then what is the role of leaders in this world?
Well, the simple answer to that is that we are humans and we need to tell stories. And we need to tell stories that glorify the human estate, that we need heroes, and we need to imagine that human actions make a difference. And leaders are part of the classic story by which we come to imagine that. So we tell stories about leaders, and leaders tell stories about themselves that allow us to imagine that we control an uncontrollable world. And that's very good. You know, it's I think if you can just imagine, that is, suppose that's your choice. You have a world that's uncontrollable. Would you rather imagine you could control it or give up? And for me, the human being who imagines he or she can control it is a more attractive human being. Now, it's possible to construct an ideology, and I've occasionally tried to, in which you combine the notion that the world is not controllable with the notion that you're still going to act decisively. That I attribute to people like Don Quixote, but even more recently to Chinese philosophy. The thread that runs through Chinese philosophy that fascinates me is a thread that says the leader should be decisive but skeptical. He should act firmly but not be very sure that he's acting correctly. Now, Westerners have great difficulty doing both of those. And I used to call it optimism without hope. As you strike head forward, even though in the back of your head you say, I don't have the remotest idea that this is going to make any difference. If you can do that, if you can combine those two, I think you're closer to being able to survive well. But for most of our training is that in order to have great action, you have to have great hopes. And one of the reasons I'm somewhat enthusiastic about that Chinese tradition is that it allows you to have great action without having great hopes. So I'm going to charge. Probably won't make any difference, but that's what I'm going to do.
Related to this is another question in a similar spirit. When we observing performance of organizations, and sometimes they have a huge success, sometimes really fiasco, and how can we really attribute this to organizations' true capability or to just luck?
Well, as you well know, most of the results that we observe probably can be attributed to luck. At least it's very hard to reject the notion that it could be luck. That, you know, the 1 in 10 million people who have heroic great results, that's about what you'd expect if you had 10 million people try and so on. So it's fairly hard to reject the notion that it's all luck. This is a stochastic world, and stochastic worlds produce all kinds of interesting results which we'd like to give more causal explanations. You know, and I used to say that the most important book in modern social science, post-World War II social science, was Feller's book, Introduction to Probability Theory. because he laid out all of the ways in which stochastic processes generate results that you will certainly think must have been attributed to something else. That's a theme that Yerker Denrell and Christina Fang have picked up on recently. But of course, that doesn't quite settle it. You can say, yes, all of the things we observe are consistent with the notion this is just a vast probabilistic generating machine. But they're also consistent with the possibility that there's actually some skill involved. And it's very unlikely that we'll have the data that will allow us to discriminate. Because to discriminate between those two normally requires some kind of experimental setting. But no, it's quite possible that there's an experimenter. Either that's we've got somebody who knows how to experiment, and the real complication for evolutionary theory in reality is we have breeders who keep intervening and producing new species or changing species. And they do that intentionally, deliberately, and they change the world. Now, we sometimes do it unintentionally, but and the nice evolutionary theory really works better without people who are screwing it up by breeding. And the same thing is probably true in the world of management.
Now, business schools use them a lot, but how much can we learn from case studies?
I'm not an expert on business cases, so I've never used one in class. But if they're done carefully, done well, they are data. They're like any other kind of field case study. Now, field case studies themselves are difficult to make very useful because it's hard to know what this one case really tells you. But you can learn something, and there are ways of doing that. At least without studying them closely, it seems to me one of the risks of business cases is that they're written often for teaching purposes. And that means that the instructor is trying to get across some point. And if you're trying to get across some point, you should not be doing field research. As field research, you have to be listening to the field, the data, not imposing your ideas on the data and not sort of making an interpretation. And, of course, business case researchers always are struggling with the trade-off between access and credibility. As they want to get access to this company, and the price of getting access is to lie about the company or to make a presentation that is acceptable to the company. And that in the business cases that are embedded in business school training have that problem very severely. Every once in a while they get caught, like the Enron cases I think have been withdrawn because they didn't really portray Enron as it really was. And I suspect that's generally true.
Managing organization is already so hard. So how about studying them? What are the main challenges facing researchers?
Well, I used to say to my students that unfortunately God gave all the easy problems to the physicists. It is difficult. It's a world that is complex, that is shifting all the time, that is hard to get access to study. That's hard to do experimental studies. So it's not an easy way. I don't think that's a reason for giving up. I think it's a reason for charging ahead, but being skeptical. And that I think we need tougher-minded people than you need necessarily in physics and chemistry, because they have to be very tough about all the ways in which they can be misled by the data. They have to be very committed to finding knowledge. And, most of my colleagues seem to be more committed to getting a publication than to finding knowledge. And that's unfortunate, I think. So it's hard. And unfortunately, you recruit smarter people to easy problems than you do to hard problems. Smart people like to be in domains where they can be demonstrably smart. You go to mathematics or physics and you can demonstrate your smartness. If you go to sociology or psychology, it's harder, because a lot of the observations of your skills are subject to random fluctuation. So even though you're smart, you may be viewed not as smart. And a smart person prefers to go places where they're actually viewed as smart. So, on the whole, we have a field that tends to recruit people who are not quite as smart as some other fields. They overlap. The distributions overlap, but the mean is lower. And we have to live with that.
We have to be pessimistic without despair.
You have to be pessimistic, but committed. Charge, but be skeptical.
And should scholars strive to be managerially relevant?
Well, I've written a bit about that. And mostly what I've written says the pursuit of relevance is the enemy of the pursuit of knowledge. And I don't believe that absolutely. I think the pursuit of relevance actually has some advantages. It gives you focus, it gives you a kind of sense of progress and a lot of other things like that. But in our field, the pursuit of relevance leads you to abandon too fast the pursuit of knowledge and to become a kind of second-rate consultant. That you're always trying, and most of that is tied to the extent to which our studies are keyed to finding out what makes a difference in organizational performance. It's a topic that is almost certainly not going to yield results, as we know enough already to know that untangling what makes results, positive results or negative results, is very hard to determine from a case study or even a relatively numerous study. Yet the pressure to do that is so strong that a very common dependent variable is performance. Now we know that performance is not very good as a dependent variable. It's very good as an independent variable. Performance affects a lot of things and we can measure those. But every time we try to say what makes performance, we don't do very well. And that most of the relevance sort of ties into that. So I used to say to my students when they asked what's the relevance of some idea that I was presenting, I said, that's your problem, not my problem. That's the problem of the person in the field, on the line, trying to figure out what to do. how can you use an idea in this situation. That's something that he can do. But for the person trying to work on ideas, that's not a very good activity.
Over the years, you have mentored an impressive group of PhD students and who later became prominent scholars. So what qualities characterize good students and how can they be nurtured?
Well, what makes good students is it happens long before they get to graduate school. So you only take advantage of them, you don't create them. But I think that it's not terribly complex. It's people who are smart, independent, and committed to knowledge, committed to finding knowledge. And that eliminates a lot of people. Some good people are just not smart enough. Some people are not independent enough, and some are not committed enough to knowledge. I encounter a fair number of very smart students these days who are mostly committed to getting a publication in an A journal. Now that seems to me a very weird kind of definition of one's objectives in life, but it's a fairly common one. I have a great nephew, very smart young man who breezed through college. Then he thought about where he wanted to go to business school, and he ended up going to Wharton, and ended up, as any good, smart person going to Wharton would, in the finance industry. And he ended up in Brazil making tons of money. And he is now awakened to the fact that he really didn't learn very much. I mean, he learned a lot about this sort of stuff, but he doesn't know much about the fundamentals of life. And he's now in the business of hiring people. And he says he doesn't want to hire these people from Harvard or from Wharton. They're just interested in getting ahead, which is to say they're just like he was. They don't have any interest in the knowledge. And, to me, he was sweet enough to say, the Stanford students have an interest in knowledge, so we want to hire Stanford. I'm not sure how much of that was flattery and how much was real, but I think the point is right, that particularly if you're talking about research, you want someone who's driven by a desire for knowledge. I had a great good fortune. I got my PhD at Yale University in the Department of Political Science. When I went there, the Department of Political Science was torn with very tough conflicts among the faculty. They hated each other. And as a result, they had very little time to interfere with my education. And I got a very good education, but the faculty had almost nothing to do with it. It's a great library, great colleagues, and so on. And I think that's true in general, that the faculty may have some marginal input, but what really is, you want a faculty that doesn't interfere with you as you go on learning. And I think the students for whom I take credit all had that attitude, basically. They all had some notion they were going to do something. They were not particularly interested in what I wanted them to do, but they would talk to me. And I said, you have to drink wine with someone for 4 years before you can talk seriously about anything. Because to talk seriously, you have to put yourself on the line and you have to really care and so on. And so most of them drank wine with me for 4 years or something like that. And that seems to me is the optimal educational procedure.
And in terms of teaching, we talk about scholars, but what should we be teaching the future business leaders? Where do you think that current business curriculum is lacking?
Well, I'm an academic, and I think universities, people learn from lots of different places, but universities have a special role. And universities should be teaching the fundamentals. Now, if you're talking about business people, they often need to know something about accounting. They need to know something about a lot of relatively routine, learnable things that they could probably learn from a good computer program. What the university should offer is training in the fundamentals. That it's more important for them to learn game theory than it is for them to learn the difference between first in and from last out, or whatever the hell it is in accounting. So my optimal business school would probably look a lot like an advanced liberal arts college. That is, you should learn some fundamental economics, you should learn some fundamental philosophy, you should learn some fundamental history, and that should be a fairly high level of intellectuality. But it shouldn't worry very much about things like business cases, because that can be learned on the job. Now, maybe you have to teach people a vocabulary so they can speak a certain vocabulary, but that shouldn't take very much time.
But in your own research, you have borrowed really richly from different fields, and many of your papers are great examples of interdisciplinary work. So what do you see as the main challenges and main strengths in this approach? Well, we are kind of lacking it right at this moment.
Well, I think it's a big problem. It's a problem on several scores. We have a lot of enthusiasm at Stanford for interdisciplinary centers. The problem with interdisciplinary work is that it's hard. That in order to do interdisciplinary work, you have to be a fully qualified person in both or all three or all four disciplines. And that's not very easy for most people. As a result, the people who go into interdisciplinary work are underqualified for the work. And the work gets a bad name, and so it's even harder to recruit good people into it. The best people go into the core of the disciplines, and it's hard to entice them out into interdisciplinary things. So you can do that, but you can't do it by hanging up a sign saying, "This is the Center for Interdisciplinary Research." You will get some interesting people, sometimes some very good people, but most of the best people will not show up. So if you're going to be a biochemist, you have to know chemistry and you have to know biology, and you have to be able to publish in journals in both fields and to be accepted as respectable in both fields. And if you're going to be a psychosociologist, whatever that may be, you better know psychology, know sociology, and be able to publish in the good journals in both, and so on. And that's hard for most people. And so you get a pool of scholars that is not as strong as you wish.
And seems like the behavioral theory of organizations, what you once called the heresy in the church of rational dogma, became quite successful, at least judging by the number of citations that the books and subsequent papers got. Do you think that the struggle for dominance is over?
Well, there is a paper that I'm not sure you found. It's called "The War is Over and the Victors Have Lost," and that paper is a tongue-in-cheek paper. So it's never quite sure when I'm serious, when I'm not in that paper. But the argument, at least, is that what's happened is that the sacred church has kept the sacred dogma, but it's changed the actual content of the dogma very significantly in the direction of behavioral ideas. So that although it is still understood that everyone maximizes expected value and seeks the optimum, by the time you get all the qualifications and all the sort of specialties around it, it sounds an awful lot like the behavioral theory of the firm. Well, I think there's some truth in that, but not entire truth. If you look at the recent Handbook of Organizational Economics, edited by Bob Gibbons and John Roberts, I think, it's all pretty economics. There's very little behavioral stuff in there. Now there's some, there's transaction cost economics, which sort of is a derivative, but the citation, I counted the Cyert and March citations in the index, and now right at the moment I don't remember the number, but it was something like 6. If you count the Bengt Holmstrom citations, the number will be 80 something, and so on. And so there are a number of people who will have 75 to 100 citations. They're all economists. I took some solace in the fact that Cyert and March was cited more often than Adam Smith, but if you read the Handbook of Organizational Economics, you would say this is pretty much economics, and there's some minor bows to other things. So I don't think the war is over, really. I think that there are a lot of good economists who worry about the future of economics and whether you can really build everything on classical economics. But I'm not sure they have any agreement on what to do.
If the struggle is not over yet, what do you see as the
if it's a struggle, I don't know. I think you should do your own work and let the world decide who's winning the war. So I think, if I've probably spent more time than I should harassing economists. Time is better spent doing your own work, getting your own ideas out, and not trying to decide whose ideas should be sacrificed.
And what do you consider as the next promising avenues in the organizational theory field?
I don't know. What are the promising avenues of the past? And if you look at the promising avenues of the past, I think you would have to say something like the behavioral theory of the firm is one of them. But you'd say that network theory is one of them. You would probably say that population ecology is one of them. And you'd probably say that game theory and organizational economics is one of them. Did anyone predict that those would be the next? Yeah, probably somebody did, but I don't know it. I think that In the domains in which I work, there's a lot of work yet to be done on the sort of evolutionary learning aspects of organizations. So I think we've really made some initial steps that are pretty good, but there's still a lot of work and a lot of empirical work that needs to be done. We're a little long on theoretical statements, a little short on empirical stuff. But that happens to be the domain I've worked in, so that's where I think the future is. And my experience in the past is the future sort of pops up off from left field somewhere, and next thing I know, there's this very interesting study that has nothing to do with anything I do, and and if I really were going to answer that question, I would also say, where are the interesting new ideas in chemistry, physics, biology, whatever? Because we steal a lot. And I think for example, we stole an evolutionary theory. Now, I think, in fact, the evolutionary theory of people like Nelson and Winter is in many ways a better biological evolutionary theory than the conventional biological theory, because the conventional biological theory has had some trouble with the same issue that we've had in economics, a tendency to want to imagine a perfectly efficient, functional operating system called evolution. And it's only as they've gotten into it that they come to see that it's not quite so perfectly efficient. The other thing that I tell my friends a good deal, particularly when we talk about novelty, which is a direction we might go, is that until we get something analogous to Mendel, something analogous to understanding the combinatorics of novelty, we'll just talk about combinatorics, but we won't really get a grip on them. And that's a huge task. That you have to figure out what the elementary units are, you figure out what their combinations are, figure out how they get combined. And it's possible we never go that way, but that's the sort of thing that would be a great thing for you guys to do.
At least we can build on your work already on technology of foolishness.
The technology of foolishness was published in 1970 or 71 or something around there. I think it's time for an improvement. So make some improvements.
Well, Professor March, thank you very much for a wonderful interview.
Thank you.